Forget the melting pot.
We need help from the media, and they're hurting us.
Today, the United States is a nation of warring factions.
Point to his name, you liar!
Where you're either Republican...
They are lucky we allow them to exist on the same continent.
...or Democrat.
The first ad suggested he didn't earn his medals. Now, isn't that outrageous?
Red stater or blue stater.
It's necessary every time we have a Democrat on to have a Republican on.
A conservative.
And if they can't do that, to shut up.
Or a liberal.
It looked like the president was pinning a medal on the Iraq war, on himself.
And where the political conversation is now a shouting match.
He didn't send enough soldiers to Iraq.
It's a clash. It's a fight. It's intended to draw blood.
We have had a loss of civility and decorum in our politics. It's gotten very nasty and very vicious.
In the U.S., when they use the words liberal and conservative, they don't mean official political parties, as in Canada, or even the kinds of philosophical differences between left and right that separate Canadian politicians. No, when Americans say liberal and conservative, they mean something more profound, a fundamental way of looking at the world, almost like a religion. And in the U.S. today, it seems, almost every American belongs in one church or the other.
I do think America is a country that's split right now. As a matter of fact, I don't think it's been this split since the Civil War.
Bernard Goldberg was a CBS News correspondent for almost 30 years. He's written about the growing gap between left and right. When you use the word liberal and the word conservative, what specifically do you mean by each?
Well, rather than defining liberal and conservative, I would say if I came up with most of the big social issues of our time, let's say abortion. Let's say you're for abortion. Let's say you're against the death penalty. Let's say you're for gay marriage. Let's say you're for gay adoption. Let's say you're for most of the things on the feminist agenda. There's a good chance, a real good chance, you're a liberal and not a conservative.
But where once opposing political views were tolerated, even respected, now liberals are the enemy.
Liberal solution to everything is don't work.
And nowhere is that change more obvious than in the media.
Without the U.S., Canada is essentially Honduras.
These days, American talk radio is a right-wing domain where liberals are pilloried by the likes of ratings king Rush Limbaugh.
All you've had is a president of the United States standing up and doing what a president's supposed to do, lead.
The titles of political bestsellers reflect the animus on both sides. Arrogance, slander, bias, lies, and the lying liars who tell them. And then there's the high-decibel world of cable television news.
You're taking cheap little pathetic shots. Trying to tell you what the truth is.
Where CNN's daily shoutfest Crossfire pitted left against right.
What you do is partisan hackery, and I'll tell you why I know
Kerry
it.
on your show, and you sniff his throne, and you're accusing us of partisan hackery?
Absolutely.
Where outspoken pundits like author Ann Coulter are household names.
They better hope the United States doesn't roll over one night and crush them.
And where cable's biggest star, not to say loudest mouth, is the domineering Bill O'Reilly of Fox News.
Why did you have to tell him you were an atheist if you didn't have any trouble reading the oaths? Why didn't you just shut up?
We have the most bitterly divided, nasty, partisan atmosphere in American politics since the 1880s. We have not been this evenly divided politically as a country in our history for more than 120 years.
Charles Lewis is a former CBS producer who founded the Center for Public Integrity, which monitors American politics and journalism. He argues that in the post-9/11 era in the U.S., partisan opinion routinely trumps fact and truth.
I'm going through some soul searching myself after the recent election to try to understand how do facts matter anymore, and do we have Republican truth and Democratic truth and red truth and blue truth, and does anyone care anymore about information? It doesn't really matter anymore. And I'm watching a situation where it depends what channel I'm watching. To whether or not we have the truth.
The mainstream media, the old media, ABC, NBC, CBS, the major newspapers in each city, and of course the New York Times nationally, Time Magazine, Newsweek, they're part of the lunatic left, which is losing power and can't figure out how to get it back.
Conservative commentator Ann Coulter leaves no doubt that in her world, it's right versus left, with us or with the terrorists. One of the things you're most often asked about is a comment you made shortly after September the 11th, 2001. And you said something to the effect that what we should do is invade their countries,
kill their leaders, convert them to Christianity. Yes, there are now T-shirts memorializing that
sorry,
with my
just
face.
say it again. What is it?
I said we should invade their countries, kill their leaders, and convert them to Christianity. And the whole topic is getting a teensy bit boring for me.
Was that a joke as well?
No, it was not. In fact, I think Canada may have noticed this, but by Friday of the week of 9/11, point 1 and point 2 were official government policy.
But it's not Al-Qaeda that's #1 on Coulter's hit list. Read her best-selling books, and you get the distinct impression she believes that to be a liberal in the U.S. is no longer a legitimate political choice, but unpatriotic, un-American, even dangerous. Do you think the tone of that debate in the U.S. these days, in effect, gives people who follow it permission to look on those who may have different philosophical or political points of view as the enemy or treasonous?
Well, they are the enemy. They're rooting against America.
Now, these are people who simply may share a different political point of view at a certain point in time than you do. How can they possibly be the enemy of this country?
Right, but the different point of view is rooting for their country or rooting against their country. They are the enemy. That's why we make fun of them.
Simply because they don't see things your way?
Apparently a lot of Americans agreed with me since they put Bush back in the White House.
I, George Walker Bush.
I, George Walker Bush.
Do solemnly.
When George Bush ends his second term in office, Republicans will have occupied the White House for 20 of 28 years.
The office of President of the United States.
And will to the best.
When we come back, how the American right took over the airwaves and Washington.
Being termed liberal is terrifying. It's terrifying.
It's hard to remember TV news before Dan Rather.
George W. Bush will be sworn in for a second term.
Don't push me. Take your hands off of me unless you plan to arrest me.
Wait a minute.
Wait a minute. Well, Walter, as you can see, I'm sorry to be out of breath, but somebody belted me in the stomach doing that. What happened is a Georgia...
They called him Gunga Dan for his intrepid reporting.
I think we've got a bunch of thugs here, Dan. Being hauled out of the
But both Rather and his predecessor as CBS anchor Walter Cronkite got another label from the political right, liberals. As far back as the 60s, the White House believed CBS reporting on Vietnam fueled the anti-war movement. And in the years to come, Rather had regular run-ins with those in power.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dan Rather with CBS News.
During Watergate, it was Richard Nixon.
Are you running for something? No, sir, Mr. President, are you?
And 1/4 of the people who say that, they rather like you, believe you're hiding something. Now posted.
He took on George Bush Sr. over the Iran-Contra affair.
That wasn't a question. It was he got apoplectic when he found out that you and the president were being party of sending missiles to the Ayatollah of Iran.
He was challenging him. That's the barking dog. That's what the press is supposed to do. Killed him for it.
Talk show host Phil Donahue, a TV contemporary, says it all made Dan Rather the journalist that conservatives love to hate.
Journalists are bashed for doing their job if they appear to be challenging the authority of Republican presidents.
Back in the 1970s, Republicans set out to challenge what they saw as the liberal domination of the American media.
Vice President Rockefeller...
And in that 30-year war, one of the front lines is right here. The Media Research Center outside Washington, the MRC for short, the listening post of the political right. "24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the MRC monitors virtually every word of U.S. news coverage on TV, cable, talk radio, and print, dissecting what they see as the liberal agenda."
A lot of what we work on is about things like what they don't tell you, what they don't report on? Or why do they call conservative groups conservative and liberal groups are just for the public interest?
MRC News Analysis Director Tim Graham is in charge of uncovering signs of bias. A telltale adjective here, the lack of one there.
Planned Parenthood's almost never described as liberal. The Sierra Club is almost never described as liberal. The NAACP is almost never described as liberal. So groups which are much more liberal and much more in your face. Greenpeace is never described as liberal.
The MRC then publishes its evidence in daily reports to 14,000 politicians, editors, columnists, and talk show hosts. Its website reaches another 100,000 each day, spreading the gospel of liberal bias.
But you're watching it on your TV. You know, what labels do they use? What words do they use to describe people? It might not be any particular word in the dictionary, but it can be just general tone.
The Media Research Center is just one of hundreds of conservative institutions financially supported by this man, Republican billionaire Richard Mellon Scaife. In all, it's been reported, Scaife spent several $100 million to do it. What the conservatives needed was an expert witness to confirm that their bias theory was right. They found one in an unlikely place.
And what I started to realize when I was at CBS News in New York is that all of these kinds of mistakes were made in a certain direction, not in both directions. Only we were just going along with the liberal agenda on all the big social issues.
Bernard Goldberg has a report.
Political violence will not end.
When Goldberg was a rising star at CBS, news was seen as a kind of public trust meant to serve the greater good.
Bernard Goldberg, CBS News, Atlanta.
The way he tells it now, that was the problem.
Walter Cronkite, who was the most trusted man in America for a very long time and the anchorman of the CBS Evening News, says, of course reporters are liberal because liberals care about the downtrodden. You know, that sounds like a good thing at first blush, but I'm saying, wait a second, Walter. In their private lives, we should all care about the downtrodden. But as reporters, we should tell you what's going on. That's it.
Goldberg says he began to see what he calls liberal cheerleading on the air for social causes like homelessness at CBS and the other big networks.
And what I started to realize when I was at CBS News in New York is that all of these kinds of mistakes were made in a certain direction, not in both directions. Whether it was AIDS, homelessness, gay marriage, affirmative action, we were going along with the liberal agenda.
You were at CBS News for 28 years?
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say there were few more elite members of the CBS elite than Bernard Goldberg.
Right.
So where were you in all of this for a quarter of a century?
For a few years in the beginning, I was as bad as everybody else. I admit it. I admit it, totally. But when I started noticing it, I started talking about it.
And then Goldberg wrote this, an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal.
The second that story came out, I turned radioactive. I became poison.
That column echoed the right-wing party line about liberal bias distorting the news, the first major network journalist to say it.
When I called my friend Dan Rather, I said, you're not going to be too happy about it, Dan. And he said, Bernie, we were friends yesterday, we're friends today, and we'll be friends tomorrow. What'd you write? And I told him what I wrote, and from that day in February of 1996 until today, my good friend Dan Rather has never uttered a syllable to me.
The right wing has somehow successfully convinced a significant number of American people that the media is liberal in the same way that the right wing convinced a significant amount of American people that George Bush was the stalwart, patriot, military figure and John Kerry wasn't.
America's news channel, MSNBC. Now, Donahue.
TV veteran Phil Donahue says if the conservative campaign was intended to make liberal a dirty word in the media, it worked.
Being termed liberal is terrifying. It's terrifying.
As for Bernard Goldberg, when he retired from CBS, he wrote a book about bias in TV news. Again, he admits, not a popular thing to do.
In my most generous mood, I'll call it deliciously ironic, and when I'm in a bad mood, I call it incredibly hypocritical, is that the people who turned whistleblowers into national celebrities turned me into and called me a traitor because I wrote about them.
All he's got in 6
When we return, Exhibit A, the man who claims to strike fear in the liberal heart.
He tries to make me out to be a liar.
No,
Hey,
that's
shut up.
No,
You had your 35 minutes. Shut up.
You're watching the #1 program on cable news. Enter the No Spin Zone on the O'Reilly Factor. The most powerful name in news. Fox News Channel.
Thanks for staying with us, and Bill O'Reilly.
If there's one man who's raised the volume and lowered the tone of U.S. television news, it's Bill O'Reilly.
What Jimmy Carter should do is privately give Mr. Bush his opinion and shut up publicly. That would be best for the country. And it is our duty as loyal Americans to shut up once the fighting begins. Once the war against Saddam begins, we expect every American to support our military, and if they can't do that, to shut up.
Bill O'Reilly's nightly rant on Fox News Channel is officially the O'Reilly Factor, though he calls it the No Spin Zone. His self-proclaimed tell-it-like-it-is take on hot-button topics from Iraq to same-sex marriage, sometimes even Canada.
I'm trying to get the point across to Canadians that Americans are getting a little fed up because the devastation that we're now wreaking upon the French economy is nothing compared to what would happen to Canada.
You're watching the #1 program on cable news. Enter the...
He's the ally the American right wanted for years, star of the most-watched show on cable news. And there's something else you should know. If O'Reilly asks for an interview, think twice.
He aggressively pursued me when he found out that I was a 9/11 family member who was against the war and signed and registered my dissent publicly.
You see, I'm sure your beliefs are sincere, but what upsets me is I don't think your father would be approving of this.
Well, actually, my father...
Jeremy Glick's father, Barry, worked at the World Trade Center and died there on September 11th. A doctoral student and anti-war activist, Jeremy was invited to discuss the invasion of Iraq.
Because you have a warped view of this world and a warped view of this country.
Well, explain that. Let me give you an example.
No, I'm not going to debate this with you.
Well, let me give you an example of parallel...
Often what Bill O'Reilly has in mind isn't debate, but diatribe.
Here's the record, all right? You didn't support the action against Afghanistan to remove the Taliban. You were against it.
Why would I want to brutalize and further punish the people in Afghanistan?
Who killed your father?
The people in Afghanistan didn't kill my father.
Sure they did. The Al-Qaeda people were trained there.
The Al-Qaeda people? What about the Afghanistan?
See, I'm more angry about it than you are.
So what about George Bush? I was expecting, him to not agree with my points. I was not expecting him to bring parents, both alive and dead, into the discussion and so directly attack and pounce on me, and it's a little disorienting.
Okay. In respect for your father...
September 14th, do you want to know what I was doing?
Shut up.
Oh, please don't tell me to shut up.
In respect for your father, who was a Port Authority worker, a fine American, who got killed unnecessarily by barbarians.
By radical extremists trained by this government.
Respect
not
for
the
him.
People of America,
I'm not
the people, the ruling class, the small minority.
Cut his mic. I'm not going to dress you down anymore, out of respect for your father. We'll be back in a moment with more of the Factor.
We're done?
We're done.
I told O'Reilly that it was cowardly for him to cut off my mic. I thought he wanted to debate me. He said, get out of my studio before I tear you to fucking pieces.
He has an air of suppressed rage, sometimes not so suppressed.
Obviously,
Heather Malik of the Globe and Mail found herself in O'Reilly's hot seat after she wrote a column welcoming 2 American deserters. O'Reilly disagreed.
If everybody deserted out of the U.S. military, you'd be in trouble up there, Miss Malik, and every Canadian, because we protect you.
He threatened us. With a boycott. He said he would destroy our economy, and I said that would be, rather self-destructive for both sides, since we are both, our biggest trading partners are each other, and he said that's not true. And
then Americans are going to take action. Are you willing to accept that boycott, which will hurt your economy drastically?
I don't think for a moment such a boycott would take place, because we are your biggest trading partner.
No, it will take place, madam.
I don't think that your
in
French
France, they've lost
has done
billions
too
of
well.
dollars. They've lost billions of dollars in France, according to the Paris Business Review.
As long as we're in the no spin zone, let's take time out for a quick reality check. The U.S. and Canada are, of course, the 2 biggest trading partners in the world. As for U.S. economic boycott of France, despite O'Reilly's comments to the contrary, since he jumped on that bandwagon 2 years ago, French-American trade actually went up. And the Paris Business Review O'Reilly quoted? To the best of our knowledge, no such publication exists.
He simply invented it. He also invented his statistics. They're not lies, they're bald-faced lies. He didn't blink as he lied. He just said it.
They lie. They will lie. And they are fanatics. And Coulter lies constantly.
O'Reilly?
Lies constantly.
Broadcasting from an underground bunker.
Al Franken, once of Saturday Night Live, is now the star of Air America, an unabashedly liberal radio network trying to dent the conservative monopoly on political talk.
Today is both an ending and a beginning.
Franken is like a lonely designated hitter for the liberals, facing a conservative lineup of O'Reilly, Coulter, Bernard Goldberg.
Go ahead, Al. The point here is, Bernie, you regurgitated a quote that you got from some right-wing media watch group.
Franken's book, Lies and the Lying Liars Who Tell Them, not only became the #1 bestseller, but enraged Bill O'Reilly when they shared the stage at a booksellers' convention.
I labeled a polka war to Peabody. He writes it in his book. He tries to make me out to be a liar.
No,
Hey,
that's
shut
up. No,
You
had your
35 minutes. Shut up.
You know, we're all flawed human beings. All of us. But there's a difference between being a flawed human being and being a big, indignant, sanctimonious, hypocritical jerk.
He calls it the no-spin zone. He says this is where you come for the straight goods.
He's pathological, and people buy it.
Do you have conservative talk radio in Canada, for example? Is there a Canadian Rush Limbaugh,
No, I'd say probably I'd be the closest thing you get to that.
Rachel Marsden may not be a Canadian Rush Limbaugh quite yet.
Just think, I really wonder, would George W. Bush have done as well in the last election if it wasn't for Michael Moore and all of his efforts?
She hosts a radio show once a week in Vancouver, and she writes on the internet. She's occasionally invited to be a Canadian conservative on American talk shows.
You know, Bill, the conservatives in Canada are neutered conservatives when it comes to the conservatives in the mainstream Canadian media. They're neutered, and that's the way Canadians seem to like them.
But politically, she and O'Reilly are pretty much on the same wavelength.
Now, CBC, national network of very far left, correct?
Correct.
You get CNN, which is a left-wing network. You've got them for many years, right?
That's right, yeah.
All right, the newspapers, I read the Toronto Globe and Mail occasionally. That could be the Havana Press. I mean, I'm not exaggerating.
Right.
I mean, they're so far left, it's frightening.
You're listening to The Rachel Marsden Show on 101.9.
Marsden is for the war in Iraq, against gay marriage, and she hates public health care. Morally, she's compared Canada to Sodom and Gomorrah. You don't really believe that.
Sure I do.
Sodom and Gomorrah?
Sure.
This is Canada.
That's right. And I mean what I said.
Sodom?
You just have to stand tall and keep your chin up and just realize that what you're doing is the right thing and stand by your principles and values. And other than
Speaking of values, which they both like to do, O'Reilly and Marsden have something else in common that didn't get mentioned in the no-spin zone. Both were recently accused of sexual harassment. O'Reilly by a female producer. The case was settled out of court. Marsden by a former boyfriend. She pled guilty to stalking. And she had a similar episode a few years ago that never made it to court. Do you think it's fair game then when someone like Bill O'Reilly is accused of sexual harassment to call them out on that? To say, you say one thing, but maybe you're doing another.
Well, sure. I mean, that's hypocrisy for sure. Yeah.
So how do you handle your own background in that context?
My own background being what?
With Liam Donnelly, with Mike Morgan, those two cases.
That's not relevant to what I do.
Well, if we're talking about someone who wants to affect the opinions of others with her views,
I just say
surely
what I feel.
veracity and judgment are things we should know about? No?
I just say what I feel. People can take and do with it what they want.
When Marsden's interview with Bill O'Reilly ended, it was clear not all his guests are created equal.
But if anybody bothers you, You let us know right away, okay?
I will. You want to know what I was doing?
Shut up.
Please don't tell me to shut up.
As respect...
Jeremy Glick wasn't so fortunate. After he opposed the Iraq War, though his father was killed on 9/11, Glick got hundreds of vengeful emails and phone calls from O'Reilly viewers, including death threats.
It was just relentless. It was relentless to the point where I paid for a service to block numbers, which I've never had to do in my life.
So you write stuff, madam, that's not true. Is that part of being a socialist?
Globe and Mail columnist Heather Malick got death threats too, and she says, worse.
I was attacked on a racial level because my father is from India and my mother's Scottish. The first ever. And I read it on my computer. And I came downstairs and I was at home and sat on the stairs and told my husband. And it affected me greatly.
And here's what happened when I read Al Franken, a list of things conservative author Ann Coulter has said that liberals hate. Liberals hate society, working class people, all religions except Islam, America, and in fact she has a corollary to that, even Islamic terrorists, she says, don't hate America as much as liberals.
Yeah.
May I interrupt you for a sec? You're a man who deals in these topics all of the time.
Yeah.
You're getting very emotional now talking about this.
I'm going to Kuwait and Afghanistan and Iraq next week for my 5th USO tour. I love my country. And this breaks my heart that this is the prevailing that this prevails, this kind of thinking.
Do you think that Ann Coulter and Bill O'Reilly, and when they make these arguments in the way they make them, understand the potential damage this could do?
I don't think they care.
But don't expect any apologies from Ann Coulter. You know, when we spoke to Franken, at one point we were talking about tone, and literally tears came to his eyes.
Did he tell you about his USO tours?
And you know what, Ann? He's not that good an actor.
Did he tell you about the USO tours?
I believe that may have been mentioned.
Yeah.
But
somehow it always comes up.
So how do you, I mean, you know the guy, you're paired with him often. How do you explain that?
I think every time I've seen him, he tears up and talks about his USO tours and what a great guy he is. I'm glad it worked on you. But why is it the conservatives' obligation to stop arguing whenever some liberal starts crying? I'm allowed to make my point. I'm just saying I make it in a lighthearted way, and we're winning and they're losing.
After the break, how the strategy of with us or against us helps start a war and win the White House.
It was fascinating to watch how things that would be said repeatedly, and many times on air on Fox, would then become just accepted as truth.
Each morning at Fox News headquarters in New York, executives send out a memo outlining the editorial plan for the day. But it's not just a rundown of upcoming stories.
You can call this the run over. You know, you're going to lay out not just what the stories are, but how to present the stories, how to package them, the kinds of language to use.
Security expert Larry Johnson, a former U.S. State Department official, was under contract as a Fox contributor. He'd previously worked for other U.S. networks.
I have seen CBS, ABC, NBC, CNN, and it was more extreme. You know, this was much more of a, I'd call it almost cult-like.
According to Johnson, that daily memo told Fox staff what political positions to take on news stories. For example, when the Bush administration replaced the term suicide bomber with homicide bomber, Fox on-air personnel were instructed to do the same.
And, you know, they were just reflecting the talking points of the White House, which I found just breathtaking then. You know, a news organization that was surrendering its objectivity to a political administration.
Of course, that's not how Fox News sees it. Fox has two marketing slogans, fair and balanced, and we report, you decide. Well, a study done at the University of Maryland illustrates the impact that Fox reporting can have on its viewers. The study looked at three misconceptions about the war in Iraq. One, that there was a direct link between Saddam Hussein and the 9/11 attacks. Two, that the U.S. found weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And three, that world opinion was largely in favor of the American invasion. Now, each of those statements is provably false, but the study found that 80% of the people for whom their primary news source was Fox believed at least one of those falsehoods was true.
One of the most interesting parts of the study was the more you watch Fox, the more likely you were to have one of these misperceptions. In other words, the more you watch Fox, the stupider you got.
And apparently it's not just Fox News viewers, but also some of those it presents as experts.
Joining us now from Vancouver is that journalist, Rachel Marsden, who writes for the United Press International.
Remember O'Reilly guest Rachel Marsden, the Vancouver radio host? Of those three misconceptions about the Iraq War, she still adamantly believes two of them. For instance, that Saddam Hussein was behind the al-Qaeda attacks on September 11th. There has been no proof whatsoever, and the administration these days makes no statements that Iraq was in any way, associated with the attacks of 9/11.
And you guys haven't been paying much attention to what the administration says, because they've made that point very clearly.
She also insists the U.S. did indeed find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Where's the proof that they were ever destroyed? Well, we know that they went in. Where's the proof they ever came out?
The administration has essentially admitted now there are no weapons of mass destruction.
By whose definition?
This is a crowd that says, please leave. Bush is a war criminal.
And Marsden isn't the only one on Fox to base outspoken opinions on misconception.
I do think liberals are going to be very happy when they immigrate to Canada.
After George W. Bush was greeted by anti-war protesters in Ottawa, conservative pundit Ann Coulter went on Fox to pronounce this about ungrateful Canadians.
They need us. They better hope the United States doesn't roll over one night and crush them.
Explain
why you said that. We were discussing the anti-war protesters. Yeah. Canada used to be one of our most loyal friends, and vice versa. I mean, Canada sent troops to Vietnam. Was Vietnam less containable and more of a threat
No, actually,
than
Canada
Saddam
did
Hussein?
not send troops to Vietnam.
I don't think that's right.
Canada did not send troops to Vietnam.
Indochina?
No. Canada, Second World War, of course. Korea, yes.
I
Vietnam,
think you're wrong.
No, it took a pass on Vietnam.
I think you're wrong.
No, Australia was there, not Canada.
I think Canada sent troops. No. Well, I'll get back to you on that.
Okay. Coulter never got back to us. But for the record, like Iraq, Canada sent no troops to Vietnam. At the Media Research Center outside Washington, news analyst Tim Graham maintains Fox News is and does what its slogans say.
I think that Fox is the only network that will say explicitly we're for fairness and balance, and that we report and you decide. I mean, I think what we see when we watch the other networks are, we'll tell you what to think, and we'll balance it any way we want. Thank you very much.
If the Republican Party had a TV show once a week, it would be Fox News. They would like you to believe otherwise, but the fact is they are what they are.
But longtime media observer Charles Lewis says, love it or hate it, the issue is no longer Fox, but the growing pro-administration bias of the supposedly liberal mainstream media. And it started here.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
The question we got the first year after 9/11 consistently by every group, no matter what part of the world, is what's happened to the American media? What happened to Woodward and Bernstein? When did American reporters get laryngitis? When did they stop asking questions? What's wrong with the media?
What followed was the rush to war in Iraq.
Most of the major American media have apologized for their coverage as being too deferential and not sufficiently critical leading up to the war And in fact, it was just that. It encouraged the war drums. They banged the war drums as loudly as anyone.
As war loomed in 2003, a consultant's report reportedly made the rounds here, evaluating NBC's 24-hour news channel, MSNBC.
America's news channel, MSNBC. Now, Donnie. Tonight.
Its prime target, MSNBC star and TV legend Phil Donahue, who had seen the talk show business dramatically change around him.
American cable television became the circus where people screamed at each other, and Fox television then really popularized the notion that the world is going to hell and liberals are leading us there.
Donahue soon found himself a lone anti-war voice, with ratings badly trailing CNN and Fox. And that's where that consultant's report came in. It slammed Phil Donahue as a left-wing liberal, out of touch with the current marketplace, and a difficult public face for NBC at a time of war. And it raised the possibility Donahue's show would become a home for the liberal anti-war agenda, at the same time as their competitors were waving the flag.
There's a fear, there's really a palpable fear among the executive decision-making levels of American broadcasting, especially when we were rolling into Iraq, of the anti-war voice. Fear.
With U.S. troops poised to invade Iraq, MSNBC canceled Donahue, blaming the ratings.
We often had larger numbers than anybody else on the network. Not every night, but often. And I truly do believe that if I had been as passionately for the war as I was against the war, I would still have a program on MSNBC.
And now that American networks are owned by huge corporations, support for the administration isn't only a matter of public opinion, but money, according to Charles Lewis.
Could the media make billions of dollars from favors from this administration when it comes to ownership decisions made by the regulators dealing with broadcasting? Absolutely. Did they make billions? Yes, as a matter of fact, they did. Did they do coverage that essentially cheerlead the war? The answer is yes. Were they being manipulated? You're damn right.
Which brings us back to Dan Rather.
It was a mistake. CBS News deeply regrets it. Also, I want to say personally and directly, I'm sorry.
This was a moment conservatives had dreamed of for decades. The American news icon in disgrace for a discredited report on 60 Minutes that questioned George W. Bush's National Guard service. The scandal brought cries of vindication from the right, who saw it as proof of left-wing liberal bias.
Now, you can imagine what would have happened if the phony story was not exposed and Kerry had won the election. You simply can't have a presidential vote influenced by journalistic fraud.
And so, once again, Fox and company have been able to make everybody crazy about Dan Rather and largely forget the fact that the ultimate story of Bush's failure to serve is true.
But the 60 Minutes furor has overshadowed something else. These days, the liberals are scouring the networks for evidence of right-wing bias and finding it.
President Bush called again today for historic changes in the biggest, most successful retirement program in the world.
One recent example, CBS White House correspondent John Roberts' story on the Bush plan to privatize Social Security. It focused on one young man.
Tad DeHaven could be the poster child for Social Security reform.
I don't expect to get anything from Social Security. Okay, I don't consider it in terms of my long-term planning and financing. It's not going to be there. That's my assumption.
So Tad is
that Tad wants a change isn't surprising. He works for a special interest group in Washington. One of their special interests? Social Security privatization. Even Tad was surprised CBS never mentioned that.
I watched the CBS piece that night. I was shocked that they didn't more clearly identify me. CBS sort of portrayed me as regular Joe six-pack walking off the street and, hey, what do you think about Social Security?
You know, this is a wink-wink exercise of ingratiation as part of the culture of Washington and the interaction between the media and those in power. It's as old as time itself.
You know, there are people in this country that don't want a president, they want a king. And they want the press to treat them that way. That's not the way it's supposed to work. You know, dissent, dissent, dissent. Otherwise, the whole American idea is meaningless.
CBS News and Fox News have at least this in common. Dan Rather turned down our request for an interview. And though Bill O'Reilly likes to disparage anyone who won't appear on his show, he wouldn't talk to us either. A Fox representative said they wouldn't cooperate because they believed we would depict the network as being conservative. They are, they say, mainstream. And these days, that may be right.
The office of President of the United States. And will...
As the second term of President George W. Bush begins, the United States remains a nation divided as rarely before.
It's a slightly modified Cadillac.
But at the inauguration, what the networks broadcast was a lot of style and little substance.
What will be the new model of Cadillac.
Pomp, not politics.
A very eloquent speech, of course. Look at that beautiful, majestic view.
Second and final term as President of the United States. It was a day of pageantry, prayers, and celebration here in the Capitol.
American inaugural tradition or the new American reality?
Celebration of American
Stay
freedom
tuned.
and democracy under tight post-9/11 security.